So we're in the middle of the series. We're ending it next week called Love, Lies, and Legacies. And we say, in our search for love, we believe lies that destroy legacies. And so we have been unpacking. It's crazy because in this particular series, this love cake, as we call it, we're getting the layers in order. If you weren't here, you have to go back and listen to all of this. But we want to make sure that first and foremost, we are building a good spiritual foundation. If you are single, you got to become, as Andy Stanley would say, the person you're looking for is looking for. You stop making a list and you start fulfilling your own list. You become whole because two halves don't make a whole, two wholes make a whole when you get married. So if you're married and you haven't got the spiritual foundation right, everything else is going to be upside down. I don't have time to go into the whole illustration, but we get it all out of order. We get these four things out of order, and then we come in with the spiritual at the end, and we say, God, will you cover our dysfunction? And God says, my goal is not to cover your dysfunction. My goal is that you would build your foundation on who I am. So we're building our foundation on our walk with Jesus, a deep spiritual walk, and then we also have the next level is our social. We're getting to know one another in social settings. We serving in church. We're in ministry together, and we see somebody. We make a connection. We start building that connection. We get to know them in the interpersonal stage. We learn about their family, if their family's cray-cray, if they're psycho, if they got issues, or we learn maybe this is somebody we really can connect with. So we're building, and then we start saying, okay, we're best friends now. We're ready to pursue the next level, and now we're getting involved emotionally. We're letting our emotions go, but we're still protecting ourselves physically. So we're working on the emotional side, and then marriage, and then the physical intimacy, sexual intimacy conversation. Here's the problem. What tends to happen is we work really hard on this while we're dating, don't we? How many of y'all remember you're over 35 years old and you remember staying up really late at night going, I love you more, love you more, love you more. Anybody, come on? Some of y'all aren't even with those people you told that to. I'm just saying. You worked on the emotions. You said kind things. You went on dates together. You showed up on time. You did what you said you were going to do. You had conflict, but you came into the conflict with a little less edge because you cared and you didn't want to lose the relationship. And then you got married. And here's what happened. Over here, this is what you built when you were single and you were dating. You started building this, but then you got married and you failed to realize that there's a whole lot of other, like you're building this emotional connection does not stop when you get married. You got to keep building this thing for decades to come. And so what happens is when you get married, if you keep building it, this thing will get stronger and stronger and stronger. The problem is instead of adding more pieces, instead of continuing to build it, instead of continuing to say, I love you, I care about you, you're incredible, like thank you, and what you tend to do, instead of doing that, is you rob the past. You steal from previous situations. And before you know it, you're constantly trying to build this thing higher versus adding to it. You're taking away because you're criticizing, you have contempt, you have issues, and now this thing gets wobbly and you wonder, well, it looks taller, it looks more secure, but it's less structurally sound. And so you piece this thing together. And so today we're going to talk about when you're married, how do you continue to add building blocks to build emotional intimacy? And so today I just want to be real careful, real clear. I got a lot of lists. I got a lot of things. We're going to buzz through it. I want to feed you with a fire hose. It's a different kind of conversation, a different kind of message, but I need you to hear this. This will change your legacy. This conversation is a legacy-altering conversation. And what I mean by that is, if you'll get this right, it will change your family tree for years to come. But if you don't get this right, you will end up roommates. You will end up living in the same house, roommates together. And so here's the lie that we are unpacking. Every week we unpack the lie that culture tells us or that we believe about whatever. Here's the lie that we believe that destroys our legacy and keeps us from building emotional intimacy, and that is this, that emotional intimacy will happen naturally. You think you get married and it's just going to thrive. No, what happens the moment you get married, you start picking each other apart, don't you? You start trying to navigate this whole relationship thing and you get hurt and you get frustrated, and now all of a sudden the emotional connection breaks down. You all of a sudden want to have the physical connection, but you don't have the emotional connection. And many people believe that love and intimacy should just happen. If you just move into the same house, you just share a room, you breathe the same air, you go to the same church, you do some hobbies together, all of a sudden it's going to be. But if you don't go at it with an intentional, vulnerable, authentic effort, you'll never build this level of your marriage, and it will ultimately lead to a disconnection. This is why so many people have their kids graduate high school, go on to college, and then they find themselves in empty nest syndrome and end up getting divorced because they never built the emotional layer. And so today, lock in, guys, lock in. Take out your phones, take pictures of the screen, do what you got to do to lock in, because let's be real honest, emotional intimacy don't sound real manly, does it? You're like, I just want to, next week we're talking about physical intimacy and sex. I'm coming back for that one. But if you come back for that one and you don't get this one, you've missed the point. All right? So, what is emotional intimacy? What is emotional intimacy? So if we're going to unpack that, let's start with the word intimacy. You will not forget this. I had a youth pastor tell me this when I was growing up 25, 30 years ago. He said this. He said, intimacy is this. Just summarize. Into me, you see. Into the depths of my soul. You know me for who I am. You know every part of me. You know everything about me, the good, the bad, the ugly. There's nothing to hide, but here's the problem, and here's why we don't develop intimacy, because we don't let people see inside of who we are. The other side of that is we don't try to learn who our spouse is. Remember all the conversations, all the questions you used to ask when you were dating, all the things you did to learn about each other, and then you got married and you quit asking those questions. You quit learning about each other. You quit letting people into your life, and you put up walls when things happen because hurt or dysfunction. And so the title of today's conversation is simply this: to be fully known, to be deeply loved, and to be completely accepted. That's what it means to have emotional intimacy. And so the crazy part about this is exactly what Jesus did for us. This is what God does for us through his son, Jesus. We are fully known, we are deeply loved, and completely accepted. All we have to do is come to him. And so the idea here is that we would have the same relationship with our spouse that we have with God. We see this mirror image in the book of Ephesians that Jesus is the head of the church. The church is his bride. He is the groom, and he laid down his life for the bride, and the bride submits to the groom. There's a mutual submission, a mutual sacrifice. And so when we're talking about this conversation around emotional intimacy, here's what it is. It's simply a deep connection between people beyond physical attraction. Okay? So it goes beyond physical attraction. Why is this important? Because you don't look all your whole life like you did when you were 25. Come on, somebody. You better have more than physical connection. You better be connected at the deepest emotional level. Here's another definition: feeling known, understood, and secure, completely secure with one another. Fully known, deeply loved, completely accepted. Listen to what Ephesians chapter 5, verse 31 says. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. We see this over and over, this whole conversation coming back from Genesis to Jesus to now Paul telling us two shall become one flesh. In other words, this is a deeply formed oneness that happens. It is not half and half. It's two wholes coming together, and two people becoming one. There is a deep emotional and one flesh bonding that is formed over time. It says this is a mystery, he goes on to say. It is profound, and I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, so he's saying Christ and the church gives us an illustration of how marriage should be. And then he says, however, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. He says there is a mutual dying to self and being vulnerable with one another and knowing each other from the depths of your soul that is important for a healthy marriage. It's like a bank account. If you want to take money out of the account, if you want that account to give something back to you, you got to make deposits in that account. You've heard this if you've read any Christian writer for the last 20 years, make deposits in the love bank, make deposits in the love bank, because what we tend to do is go to the love bank and take withdrawals. And so emotional intimacy, part of one of the greatest things you can do to build emotional intimacy is to make deposits like you would every week into the bank so you can continue to sustain your standard of living. You're making constant deposits into your spouse's love bank. The Journal of Marriage and Family said this: 67% of couples reported lower marital satisfaction due to emotional disconnection rather than external issues like finances or parenting or other things that may influence. What they're saying is this: if they can get the emotional connection right, everything else works itself out. If I can connect with you emotionally, we can get through the financial stuff. If we have a deep connection emotionally, we can help learn to parent together. If we have a deep connection emotionally, we can do just about anything. Now, here's the key. When you have two believers, that emotional connection is also a spiritual connection. And so then, one of the things that keeps us, many of the things, I should say, several things that keeps us from actually connecting on an emotional level the way God intended is this. We allow our past hurts, our triggers, our experiences, our trauma, what we went through as a child to actually keep us from letting our guard down. We don't know ourselves, and so therefore we won't let anybody else into our world. And so I want to show you a quick book. We're going to do this. If you're not in a pathway is just a life pathway. We say you live on mission, you're intentional in friendships, you're faithful in generosity, empowered by the Holy Spirit. That is what we believe you should live your life by. And we have these pathways of growth and development. And so in the fall, we're going to be doing a pathway in our marriage and family, a book in our marriage and family pathway called How We Love. Now, let me just tell you, there's a book, there's a workbook. You can get them both on Amazon. They're really cheap right now. But you read the book, you do the workbook. And let me just tell you what happened. When Julie and I did this, I learned more about my wife in 8 weeks than I had learned in 20 years. Because it was a guide. And it wasn't because we didn't try. It's because we didn't really know how. We had a lot of great things going, but we learned a lot about our childhood, our teenage years, the things we experienced, the things she experienced. I learned more about her in about 8 to 10 weeks than I have ever learned in 20 plus years. And so you can get that book. And what this allows us to do is process all the things from our childhood to allow us to be more vulnerable so that we can open up emotionally to one another in a way that maybe we haven't been able to do. So let me just run through several things today, and then we're going to send you home to process and have a conversation. Some of you will need to sign up for counseling to talk to somebody. But here we go. You ready for this? There are 4, John Gottman says there's 4 horsemen that will destroy your marriage. And what he says is there's 4 things that he can test and determine the success rate in your marriage and whether you're a high or low candidate for divorce. He calls them the 4 horsemen. I call them the 4 assassins of emotional intimacy because they're sitting there waiting to pick you off at any given time. And so let's talk about what those 4 things are, and I'm going to give you a couple takeaways from each one. The first one is this: criticism. Criticism. Thank you, ma'am. Criticism. Here's what criticism is. It's an attacking of your partner's character or personality rather than focusing on specific behaviors or actions. In other words, instead of attacking the problem, you attack the person. All right, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how this might sound. Let's say they don't help around the house. You don't say, "You never help around the house. I do everything around here." Anybody ever said that? Come on. Instead, we would say something a little more gentle. "I feel overwhelmed when I have to do everything. Can we figure out a way to share responsibilities?" You see the difference in that language? One is, "You suck at life." The other is, "Hey, here's how I'm feeling. Could you help me right now?" I'm gonna give you one more and we'll keep going. Distracted by the kids. "You never pay attention to me anymore. All you care about is the kids." Okay, that's gonna sit real well. Versus, "I love how much you care about our kids, but I miss spending time together. Could we plan a date night?" Do you see the difference on how one is building and one is tearing down the emotional conversation? This happens when somebody's not affectionate. Maybe there's screen time distractions and you say, "Oh, you never listen when we talk. You're always on your phone." Okay, 85% of y'all have said that. Rather than attacking, "You're always you. Why don't you say, "I feel unheard when I'm talking to you and you're on your phone. Can we put them away during our conversations?" Do you see the difference? I can go through a whole list of these. Here's the second one, okay? Before I get to the second one, Proverbs chapter 15 says, "A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." So when you come at somebody, your spouse, and you're like, "You did this," and you start attacking, what is it? This proverb tells us it's going to stir up something inside of them that you don't want stirred up. And some of us do it intentionally. Come on. You're like, I know how to push his buttons. I know what'll get under her skin. Here's the second one. Contempt. So you got criticism. Critical couples are at high risk for divorce. But the number one, John Gottman says, the number one leading factor that he can determine if predict a divorce in a marriage is this idea of contempt. What is contempt? Attacking your partner with the attempt to belittle or insult them that ultimately makes them feel less valued or worthless. Anybody ever done that? Some of you felt that, and some of you have done that, and you've done it intentionally. And you wonder why you're not connected. This sarcastic remarks sounds like this. You can't do anything right, I'll just do it myself. Instead of saying that, why don't you say, I'm frustrated with the way things turned out. Let's work together to figure out how we can fix it. All right? What about when you're having a conversation and you have so much disdain or resentment or contempt for someone, you just roll your eyes. Some man came up to me after service and said, my wife don't just roll her eyes, she rolls her whole neck. Instead of rolling your eyes and exaggerated facial expressions, why not say, I'm really frustrated right now. I don't want to dismiss your feelings. I just need a few minutes to process. Our counselor calls it a timeout with a time limit. In other words, I got to breathe. And so we take a timeout. Hey, I need a timeout right now. And then guess whose responsibility is to come back to the conversation? The person who called the timeout. Because the other person's going, when are we having the conversation? And so a timeout with a time limit, you can't say, I'll be back by 2030. And like, within 24 hours, we're going to continue this conversation. While it's still, the sooner the better, but within 24 hours. So here's some other ideas of contempt. Belittling your partner's ideas or efforts, calling your partner names, dismissing your spouse's emotions. Don't ever say, you're overreacting, what's the big deal? Please don't ever say that. You can say, I see this is really bothering you, let's talk it through. Okay? Ephesians chapter 4, let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up as it fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. One translation says, you only speak words that build the other up according to their needs. Okay, and so this contempt will destroy. Here's the third one, defensiveness, the third assassin. Defensiveness is denying responsibility, counterattacking, or making excuses to deflect blame instead of owning up to one's role in the conflict. Anybody? Don't elbow your spouse. So we blame shift. You ever heard somebody say, well, I wouldn't have snapped if you weren't nagging me? As if nagging gives you the right to snap. Versus saying, I shouldn't have responded that way. I'm sorry. Let's talk about what's frustrating both of us. See the difference? We downplay things. This is a defensive tactic. You're overreacting. It's not that big a deal. We counterattack. We say things, well, you, and you fill in the blank. Somebody comes and says, hey, this bothered me when. You're like, well, you did this. We counterattack. We're defensive. We have times where we make excuses. We bring up past mistakes of the other person. Do you see that's defensiveness? We minimize the issue. You're blowing things out of proportion. We minimize the other person's feelings. We play the victim, don't we? Instead of playing the victim, maybe we say, I don't fully understand. I'm having a hard time processing, but I want to take responsibility for my part as we navigate this. You and I have to own our part and not shift the blame or deflect it to the person we're having a conversation with. This is fascinating. Matthew chapter 7. I'm going to flip this on its head here for a second. Jesus says to his disciples, why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but not notice the log that is in your own eye? The person that deflects cannot see the log in their own eye. And so what happens is so often is somebody will walk into a room with a speck in the eye and say, hey, something's bothering me. I need to talk to you. You're sitting there with a log sticking out of your forehead, and you're like, don't talk about my log, let's get the speck out of your eye. That's what defensive people do. You take a defensive posture, and you would rather be right or rather prove your point than remove the log from your eye. Now, listen, if your partner, if your spouse has some issue that you need to address with them, we talked about how to address that last week. What we don't do is wait till our spouse gets up the courage to come and have a conversation and go, okay, I got a loaded gun, you ready? And now all of a sudden, have you ever been in a conversation with your spouse or someone else, and you started the conversation, you go in with the idea to bring resolution, and all you get is pushback, and now when you came with the issue, all of a sudden you feel like everything's turned on you? That's defensiveness. That will destroy emotional intimacy. Be receptive to hearing. He goes on to say, how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye when there's a log in your own eye? You hypocrite. First, take the log out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Now, if you're the one with the log, don't start the argument either. Don't start the conversation. Don't start the discussion. Don't bring up the conflict until you're willing to admit what's going on. So here's the last one, stonewalling. Men, I'm talking to you. Most of the time, 85% of stonewallers in marriage are men. Well, I thought it was fascinating. What is stonewalling? Withdrawing from the conversation or emotionally shutting down, often because of feeling overwhelmed or flooded. We usually do it, men, out of anger. A lot of times, ladies, you'll do it because you're just flooded and you have a hard time. You're like overwhelmed and you can't process, and so you just kind of pull back. What does stonewalling look like? Avoiding, not responding to text messages or phone calls in order to punish and show them. Come on. Giving one-word responses. It's fine. I don't care. That's 3 words, but you get it. I don't know. Sure. Whatever you want. Short, snippy. What you're saying is, I don't really, just do what you're keeping them from the vulnerable side of who you are. Avoiding eye contact or turning away, closing off emotionally, physically leaving the room. Silent treatment. Again, I take you back to a timeout with a time limit and do it in a mature way. Ephesians chapter 4 says, be angry. I love this. He doesn't say, if you're angry. He says, go ahead, be angry. You're going to be angry. You're going to have emotions. Fill in your emotion. Fill in your feeling. Whatever it is you're feeling, whatever emotion, go ahead and be that, but don't sin. Go ahead and feel it, but don't sin. You can feel a certain way and then respond in a way that honors God. Be angry and do not sin. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. Whatever you're feeling, don't let the sun go down on it. If it's something that is building inside of you, deal with it and give no opportunity to the enemy himself. And so, how then, if we have things that destroy marriages? So what happens is when we stonewall, when we are defensive, when we have contempt, or when we criticize, what we're doing is we're weakening the base of our marriage. So what we want to do is continue to keep the base strong and add more pieces to the thing. So when our kids leave and we're alone and we're looking at each other across the couch, we actually like each other and we're not getting divorced when our kids leave the house. Okay, so how do we strengthen emotional intimacy in marriage? There's this one little verse in Song of Solomon that you can read right over. It's parallel between 2 things, 2 lovers, but also it's indicative of Christ and the church and his love for the church. But I love what it says in Song of Solomon chapter 2, verse 4. It says, he brought me to the banqueting house, and his banner over me is love. There's so much packed into those like 10 words or so. So what is the banqueting house? What did the banqueting house? This is my lover brought me into the banqueting house. The banqueting house was a place of celebration, joy, feasting. It was a place where love and intimacy were shared freely, and it symbolized the lover drawing in his bride into a relationship of deep affection, delight, honor, and commitment. And it signified, listen, a place of abundance and security in love. And then it says, the banqueting house, and the other is, his banner over me was love. So love is the banner, but what was this symbolized? In that culture, it's a military term, and what would happen is when they would fly a banner, it was a symbol of protection, security, identity, and allegiance, meaning I am 100% committed to you till death. And here's the crazy part about the banner. They waved it and flew it proudly. And so what this young lady is saying is my husband brought me in to the banqueting house, and he covered me and he sheltered me with his love. We were connected beyond physical. We were connected beyond what was going on. There was a deeper safety that was developed in our relationship. And so, if you're going to strengthen your emotional intimacy in marriage, here's just a few things you can do. Number 1, immerse yourself in each other's worlds. Notice I did not say lose yourself in the other one's world. There's a big difference. But what happens, we spend so much time, you know this? You fell in love because you immersed yourself. Like you talked, you were on time, you showed up, you couldn't wait to see each other. You immersed yourself. And then you got married. You're like, well, I guess that's the end of it. And you stopped. What does it look like to immerse yourself in each other's world? Who is your spouse? Do you know? This is why how we love changed so much about how we communicate in our marriage. Julie and I. What is their temperament? What is their personality? How are they wired? What trauma have they been through? What is their love language? What did they experience in life that you don't even know about? Listen to what it says in 1 Peter chapter 3. Husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way. Here's the second thing. Cultivate fondness and admiration. Cultivate fondness and admiration. It says, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let his wife see that she respects her husband. What is he saying? There is a mutual submission and a mutual dying to self for the other one. In other words, you're learning your spouse and you're cultivating a fondness and an admiration. You speak life to each other. You share notes with each other. You flirt with each other. You send texts with each other. Here's the way it looks. Ask yourself what my spouse might love from me right now, and I'm going to do it before I go to bed. Like, you don't have to do this every hour, every day, but like, okay, I'm sitting on the couch. There's nothing to do. I'm just kind of checked out. What is it that my spouse loves, and how can I serve them? So how many of y'all know your wife's favorite smell? Any men in the house? Wow. We probably should start there. You know the number one sense is smell, right? So I'm not saying I know my wife's favorite smell, but I know one of her favorite smells, okay? And it's not because she sniffs this, but one of my wife's favorite smells is Fabuloso. Because it represents a clean house. She goes, I love that smell. I'm like, ooh. I feel like y'all ever been to the Mexican restaurant in town and they start locking it up early, trying to get you out of there, and you're like, the whole place smells like Fabuloso. She's like, I love it. What I learned, if I want to develop and cultivate admiration and fondness, I want her to be fond of me, boy, I got to learn to use the splash a little bit of stuff. Come on. When she walks in, y'all can tag Fabuloso. I'll do the commercial for him. Sir, sometimes you've never been more sexy than with a bottle of Fabuloso. I'm just saying. Why is this important? What you're saying to your spouse, ladies, whatever it is, friend, I see you, I know what matters to you, and I'm willing to give to you. And I'm cultivating a connection. So my wife just got back from Honduras yesterday. Let me tell you something. I learned a hard lesson years ago. She went out of town. See, there's a difference for most of us. Some of you men are the OCD when in your marriage. There's a difference when a man says something's clean and a woman says something's clean. I never forget, I don't know, years ago, she comes home from somewhere. She was out of town. She don't go out of town a ton. And something's wrong. What's wrong, baby? I don't know. It took me asking a dozen times. She's like, I just don't appreciate coming home and the house it was clean when I left. And I was like, those bandits, they done broke in. They done messed up everything. No. And I was like, I didn't even realize. Boy, you better bet. You know what the house smelled like when she got home last night? Fabuloso, baby. You know what she said? Thank you for keeping the house clean. It's me and 2 teenage boys. Now, my youngest teenage boy, in his room, we just close the door. We don't worry about that one. Right? But what I was saying is, I'm cultivating fondness and admiration. You're the queen of this house. Okay? Next one. You got to learn to turn toward each other. They shall become one flesh, Genesis 2 says. One flesh does not mean pulling opposite ends of the rope. It means we turn toward each other. There's something called a bid for connection. If you study relationships, and a bid for connection might be she's in the kitchen and the pans are just clanging a little too loud, and you realize something's wrong, or he comes in and that's a bid for connection. He's saying, I need you to see me. She's saying, I need you to see what's going on. You got to respond to those bids for connection. You got to notice them. You don't even have to understand them, y'all. Don't even try to understand what your wife's thinking when she gives a bid for connection. Just acknowledge the bid. You don't have to, you're like, that's cool, girl. I'm good. I don't have a clue what she's saying, but I'm good. I'm here. You don't have to understand why it bothers you. Acknowledge that he needs your attention. Now, this can't be some codependent relationship, but you got to understand, you got to turn toward each other. I think it's number 4. Let your partner influence you. Whew. Did you see, so many people got married and said, this is the way I am. Well, you need a new personality. Amen. I don't know what's going on, but talk afterwards. Submit to one another, Ephesians 5, out of reverence for Christ. So many marriages, so many relationships get in and they bury their heels in the sand. And in doing so, it is a direct, now, like, don't do anything that's immoral or ungodly or takes you away from your walk with God. But if you're just stubborn, that's not just against your spouse, it's also irreverence for Christ. Submit to one, allow your spouse to influence you. Don't be so stubborn. If you're two believers loving Jesus, then let your spouse influence you. In parenting, in finances, in big decisions, speaking life into the dark sides, allow them to bring self-awareness to you. Come on. If we could all raise our level of self-awareness, the whole world would be a better place. Allow your spouse to speak into that, okay? Solve solvable problems. He's like, okay, what does that even mean? Some of us have things that have been lingering for 10 or 20 years that could have been put to death with one conversation. But you keep bringing them back up. Keep doing the same thing over and over. Matthew 18 says, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. In other words, like, if you're going to go to your brother who hurts you or sins against you, you should also go to your spouse. But what you do is you hold frustration and contempt, and you're building all this stuff up, and rather than having a conversation and trying to solve the problem, you just bury it. But here's what you need to understand. You always bury it alive. You think it's gone, but it's still alive. It's still in there. And you never solve the solvable problems. You got silly stuff like, we don't spend enough time together, and you spend too much money, and you spend more time with your friends, and you're always on your phone, and we don't have equal distribution among housework, and we don't, our schedules are all these stupid little things that could be fixed if you would just mature and grow up and lean into one another. But we just dig our heels in, and we don't allow our spouse to influence, and we don't look for solving the problem. We rather attack the person. And it destroys emotional intimacy, okay? A mentor once told me this: unresolved anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick. And that's what's killing so many marriages. I'll give you these two real quick. Overcome the gridlock together. This means that when you can't solve problems, you need outside help. I was so grateful, man. Almost 45 people have signed up for counseling this past week in their personal life, in marriages. Why? Because Proverbs 24:6 says, by wise guidance, you can wage your war, and in abundance of counselors, there is victory. Sometimes you can't overcome it by yourself. Last one, create fun and flexibility. This is where you got to become best friends. Like, don't marry someone who's not your best friend. If you're single, lean in. If they're not your best friend, don't marry. I don't care how cute or how sexy or how attached or how famous or whatever. I don't care. If they're not your best friend, it's going to struggle. You're going to fight through. Become best friend. Now, when you get married, learn to have fun and keep that friendship alive. I love what Proverbs says. It says, a joyful heart is good medicine. You realize if you would just have more fun together, you might like each other more. And so go for walks, plan date nights, laugh together. Don't do things that cause conflict. Like, if game night is always a conflict at your house, it's supposed to be fun, but it turns into a conflict, kill the game night and go for a walk. If everybody comes over and y'all are excited, but you're fighting at midnight after everybody left, stop it. Find things that are fun, because that's the most important relationship this side of heaven. And so, Julie and I'm telling you, man, I don't like to go for a walk. I'd rather go play a sport or something like that. But I'm telling you, we talk more and we laugh more and we tell more stories. And I've learned that, like, walking, I hate winter because we can't go for walks. It's too cold. I mean, we can, but we're sissies. So, all right, so real quick, I'm going to hit these 4 things and then we're going to be done. Y'all got a lot to process. I could spend 6 weeks on this. Next week, we're going to talk about physical and sexual intimacy. check your kids into the kids' environments, okay? Do not be offended if you don't. And I say something that you're like, your kid's like, Mommy, what's he talking about? That's on you, okay? But today, you got a lot to process this week. There are some barriers that are keeping so many of you from actually connecting with your spouse the way God intends. And I was laying in bed last night. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't sleep at all last night. Probably got 2 hours, and 2 hours of sleep. I felt like in my spirit, there's some people here today. Look, I don't even claim this is from God, because in a crowd this size, it's just statistically possible. So I'm not gonna try to manipulate anything, but I just felt the Holy Spirit prick me and say, stop in the middle and bring this up. There's some people, your love has grown so cold that you don't even care if your marriage makes it. You're not even willing to, you're saying, I don't even phone do the work. For some of you, there's no reason other than the fact that you don't connect emotionally. There's no like biblical reason. It's just you're not connected and you're ready to give up. And I just want you to know, God sees you. He cares about you. And I think these 4 things, somewhere in these 4 things you might find yourself. So lean in for about 5 more minutes and we're gonna be done. 4 barriers to emotional intimacy. Number 1, unresolved emotional wounds or trauma. You don't love yourself, you don't love your life, so how can you let someone else love you? Unresolved emotional wounds or trauma. 80% of adults who experience childhood trauma struggle with relationship difficulties, often because they have trust issues, fear of abandonment, and they have difficulty being vulnerable, because last time you were vulnerable, someone took advantage of you. Last time you were vulnerable, somebody hurt you. Last time you opened up, somebody dismissed you. And I'm telling you, when we dug through how we love, some things came up. And it was things that I don't know that we knew about ourselves, because you buried them alive, okay? Deal with the unresolved emotional wounds or trauma. Mental health challenges, depression, anxiety, stress. Studies show us that couples where one partner struggles with untreated depression, anxiety, or too much stress, they're likely to experience significant, keyword, marital distress. And so there's things, hormone levels, there's dealing with trauma that can help you handle those things. There's medication at times if you need to go that direction. But the goal is not to dabble or to bury yourself or sink in your mental health struggles. The goal is to help you overcome them so you can engage, not that you're numbing your way through it. Number 3, unspoken resentment or unmet needs. We talked about this last week. I won't go into the whole thing. We have unspoken expectations, and it leads to this cycle of poor communication, and then all of our needs go unmet, and then we come back and now we lash out in resentment because things weren't met that we never communicated. And so we got to learn to communicate those things. 67% of divorces are attributed to poor communication and unmet emotional needs. Last one, spiritual and personal disconnect. Studies show that couples who pray together are 74% more likely to report high relationship satisfaction. Now, what happens, and I want to show you something here. We don't work on this, men, but we want to work on this. This is a Band-Aid for this. And so, men, you were 25 once. Maybe you're not 25. Maybe you don't have that same energy. You're 25. You're ready to get married. You're 21, 22. You're like, man, we get married, we have sex every day. But you ain't prayed with your wife one day yet. How about we pray together before we come together in unity? And so at the end of the day, what happens if you're in a boat? You're on one side, you're rowing on one side, she's rowing on the other, and one person stops rowing. What happens? The boat goes in a circle. And when one of you spiritually disconnects from God, or personally disconnects from the other one, your relationship is just going to spin out of control. You're going to find yourself in the same arguments, the same situations, the same dysfunction, because you're unwilling to connect with God, be vulnerable with Him, and be vulnerable with your spouse. And so you cannot fix what you will not face, and you cannot slap a Band-Aid on a broken heart. And for some of you who are ready to give up, you're mad, you're angry, you don't know what the future looks like, you're trying to figure out what you're going to do when the kids leave, you're scared to death about the future of your marriage. Don't try to Band-Aid it. Can I encourage you to do the hard work? Go to counseling in the fall. Get in this How We Love. Julie and I will be a part of much of that with you. But this one breaks my heart because I see couples all the time. Who are trying so hard to fix their issues by Band-Aiding them, but never really breaking down and being vulnerable with God and with one another. So I'm asking you to stand with me. We're going to close with just a simple prayer, and then you guys can go and process all of this and come back next week. We'll have a lot of fun. Let's close our eyes together, and don't move around just for a moment. Just stay with me. All heads bowed, eyes closed, just as a sign of surrender. I've got my hands, my palms wide open to heaven, just saying, God, I need you right now, because this, just being honest, at the core of who I am, I had to fight through some codependency issues. And in fighting through the codependency issues, what I realized is that I was not very vulnerable. I was not very open. I was not very authentic. I was not very real. And it was keeping me from being able to truly connect at the deepest emotional level. And so maybe that's you, men. Maybe that's you, ladies. Would you just lift your hands as a sign of surrender and say, God, I'm surrendering my inability to humble myself before you and my spouse. I want to be vulnerable. I want to be open. There's a lot of things that are going on in some of your lives that really need the power of the Holy Spirit and deep counseling and to work through some of the pain. But for you, this is about you being vulnerable and open and doing your part. And I got my hands lifted with you as a sign of surrender. And I want to pray over you. Father, in this moment, there are so many marriages that are struggling, and that you're healing during this series in ways that I can't even imagine. But I pray that you would help us to, first of all, realize we are fully loved, fully known, and fully accepted by you first. And we have our identity in Christ. And in that identity, we can rest knowing that if everybody else rejects us and hurts us, we have you. And in knowing that, we're able to be more vulnerable, not worrying about what people say or think. So help us to build this emotional connection. Help us to take the steps. Help us to do the things that we need to do on our own to lay down our life for our spouse and love them and meet their needs and connect with them in a real way. We love you and we thank you, and I pray you bless the conversations that come out of this. As some of these conversations lead to tension and fighting and arguing, God, I pray that we would move toward solving problems, not attacking one another in this season. In Jesus' name. And everybody said, amen. God bless you, church. We'll see you next Sunday.